The heavy scent of lilies in the cathedral felt more like a funeral than a wedding. Aria Thorne stood at the altar, her fingers trembling as she clutched a bouquet of white roses that had begun to wilt under the harsh glow of the chandeliers. For 3 hours, she had been the target of hushed whispers and mocking sneers from the elite of the city. They knew the truth. Her father had sold her to the Moretti family for $80 million to cover his gambling debts. She was a transaction, a body bought to settle a ledger. The heavy oak doors swung open with a violent thud, and the atmosphere turned arctic. Dante Moretti strode down the aisle, his presence a suffocating weight of dark silk and lethal intent. He didn't look like a groom. He looked like an executioner. He didn't stop to take her hand. Instead, he pulled a thick leather-bound folder from his jacket and tossed it onto the velvet altar. It landed with a slap that echoed through the silent hall. "Sign it," Dante commanded, his voice a low, jagged blade. "You drugged me to crawl into my bed, and now you've used the child in your womb to blackmail my family. You wanted the title of Mrs. Moretti? You have it. But this contract ensures you are nothing more than a servant who sleeps in the attic. My heart belongs to a woman named Rose, and a gold digger like you isn't fit to even speak her name." The Moretti manor sat atop a jagged cliff, a sprawling fortress of gray stone and glass that seemed to draw the very warmth out of the air. It was a place of architectural beauty and spiritual desolation. For Aria, it was a gilded cage where the bars were made of silence and spite. Following the wedding that had been nothing more than a public shaming, she had been stripped of her silk gown and handed a coarse gray uniform. Dante had been true to his word. While the world believed the Thorne daughter was living a life of luxury as the wife of the city's most powerful man, Aria was confined to the servants' wing. Her room was a drafty attic space with a narrow cot and a single window that overlooked the jagged rocks below. The morning sun had barely touched the horizon when the heavy iron bell rang, signaling the start of her duties. "Moving slow today, aren't we? Just because you're carrying a royal brat doesn't mean you get to slack off," a sharp voice barked. Aria looked up, wiping sweat from her brow as she knelt on the cold marble floor of the grand foyer. Gia Rossi stood above her, dressed in a crimson silk robe that probably cost more than Aria's father's house. Gia was Dante's assistant, but everyone in the household knew she was the woman he intended to marry once he found a way to dispose of Aria. Gia claimed to be Rose, the girl who had saved Dante's life in the mountains years ago, and Dante protected her with a ferocity that bordered on worship. "The floor needs to be scrubbed again," Gia sneered, deliberately tipping a crystal glass of red wine over the white marble. The liquid splattered against Aria's pale shins, staining the hem of her gray dress. "It looks a little dull. Just like your eyes." Aria didn't argue. Experience had taught her that a single word in her own defense would only bring Dante's wrath. She dipped her brush back into the bucket of soapy water, her knuckles raw and red from the lye. Her back ached with a dull, throbbing intensity. She was 6 months pregnant, and the weight of the triplets, though she didn't yet know there were 3, pressed heavily against her spine. As she worked, the sound of heavy boots echoed down the hallway. Her heart skipped a beat, a traitorous mix of fear and a lingering, inexplicable hope. Dante Moretti entered the foyer, looking impeccable in a charcoal suit. He paused, his eyes flickering toward the woman kneeling on the floor. For a split second, Aria thought she saw a flash of something other than hatred in his dark depths, perhaps a memory of a girl he once knew, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a wall of ice. "Dante, darling," Gia chirped, gliding over to him and wrapping her arms around his neck. "I was just telling Aria how important it is to keep the manor clean for your guests tonight. She's so dedicated, even in her condition." Dante's gaze remained fixed on Aria, who refused to look up. "She chose this path when she decided to trap me," he said coldly. "If she's tired, it's a fatigue she bought with $80 million. Ensure the silver is polished by noon." I won't have my house looking like a pigsty because the lady of the manor is feeling lazy." "Of course, Dante," Gia smirked, casting a triumphant look back at Aria. The day progressed in a blur of physical agony. Aria was moved from the floors to the laundry, where she was forced to hand-wash heavy linens in steaming water. The heat in the laundry room was suffocating, making her dizzy. She leaned against the stone basin, gasping for air, her hand instinctively resting on her swollen stomach. She felt a faint kick, a tiny rhythmic reminder that she wasn't alone in this nightmare. "I'll protect you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't care what they do to me, as long as you are safe." But safety was a luxury the Moretti manor didn't provide. That evening, as she was lugging a heavy tray of firewood up the narrow servant staircase, her foot slipped on a patch of wax Gia had accidentally left behind. Aria plummeted forward, the heavy wood spilling across the stairs. She managed to catch herself before falling down the flight, but the jarring impact sent a sharp, stabbing pain through her abdomen. She gasped, clutching the railing, her face turning ashen. She waited for someone to help, for a maid or a guard to see her distress. Instead, she heard laughter from the dining room below. Dante and Gia were entertaining guests. Aria forced herself to stand, her legs shaking uncontrollably. She bit her lip until it bled, refusing to let a scream escape. She retreated to her attic room, the shadows closing in. She lay on the hard cot, shivering despite the summer heat. She thought of Liam, the boy from the mountains who had promised to find her. He had been kind and brave, the polar opposite of the monster who lived downstairs. She clutched a small dried mountain flower she kept hidden in her locket, her only link to a past that felt like a dream. As the hours ticked toward midnight, the door to the attic creaked open. Dante stood in the doorway, the scent of expensive whiskey clinging to him. He looked at the disheveled woman on the bed, his expression unreadable. "I heard you were clumsy on the stairs," he said, his voice strangely quiet. "I'm fine, Mr. Moretti," Aria replied, her voice devoid of emotion. He stepped closer, his shadow looming over her. "Don't think that harming yourself will get you a seat at my table. You are here to serve a purpose. Once the child is born, our business is concluded." Aria looked him in the eye for the first time that day. "Is that all I am to you, Dante? A business transaction?" He flinched, a flicker of pain crossing his face before the mask of the Mafia Boss returned. "You lost the right to ask me questions the night you sold your soul to your father. Sleep. Tomorrow the gardens need weeding." He turned and left, locking the door behind him. Aria lay in the darkness, the silence of the manor pressing down on her like a tombstone. She knew the brutal boss had no mercy, but as she drifted into a fitful sleep, she prayed that her innocence would be enough to save her children from the coldness of the man who was supposed to love them. Click the like button to see Aria finally slap the woman who stole her identity. The months that followed were a descent into a private purgatory. Aria's belly grew with a weight that felt unnatural, stretching her skin until it was translucent. She didn't know she was carrying triplets. The doctors Dante provided were under strict instructions from Gia Rossi. They told Aria she was simply fattening up on the Moretti's dime, while they whispered to Dante that she was likely exaggerating her symptoms to gain his pity. On a night when the sky was choked with black clouds and the wind howled against the stone cliffs of the manor, the first contraction hit Aria like a physical blow. She was in the laundry room, folding heavy towels, when a sharp, tearing sensation surged through her lower back. She gasped, her knees buckling, as a warm gush of fluid soaked through her gray uniform. "Help!" she cried out, her voice barely a whisper against the thunder. "Please, someone help me." She dragged herself toward the service bell, her fingernails clawing at the stone floor. It took nearly an hour before a disinterested maid found her. Instead of calling an ambulance, the maid informed Gia. Aria was moved not to a hospital, but to a cold, sterile guest room in the basement of the manor. The walls were bare stone, and the only light came from a flickering overhead bulb. Dante stood by the door, his arms crossed, his face a mask of sculpted granite. Beside him, Gia clung to his arm, her eyes wide with faux concern. "Dante, the doctor said she's just starting," Gia whispered, her voice loud enough for Aria to hear between her screams of agony. "He said she's making it sound worse than it is to make you feel guilty for the contract. Women like her have high pain tolerances. They're built for this kind of labor." Dante's jaw tightened. He looked at Aria, whose face was drenched in sweat, her knuckles white as she gripped the iron bed frame. "The doctor is on his way," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "Stop screaming, Aria. You're disturbing the household." "Dante, please," Aria sobbed, another contraction ripping through her. "Something is wrong. It hurts too much. I need something for the pain." Gia stepped forward, placing a hand on Dante's chest. "Darling, the doctor warned us about this. He said she might try to demand heavy sedatives so she can claim medical malpractice later. We have to be careful. For the baby's sake, it's better if she stays alert and natural." Dante nodded slowly, his eyes flashing with a mix of suspicion and hidden turmoil. "No anesthesia," he commanded the arriving physician, a man whose eyes were cold and bought by the Moretti payroll. "Do it naturally. I want to ensure the child is unaffected by drugs." The hours that followed were a blur of screaming shadows. Aria was pushed into the dark valley of death. Without medication, the sensation of 3 bodies shifting and pressing against her internal organs was more than a human should endure. Every time she felt she would lose consciousness, the doctor would shake her awake, his touch rough and impatient. "Push!" the doctor barked. Aria's vision was failing. In the corner of the room, she saw Dante standing like a dark sentinel. She wanted to tell him that she was the girl from the mountains, that she still had the flower, but the pain robbed her of her tongue. She looked at Gia, who was smiling, a tiny, wicked curve of the lips that only Aria could see. Finally, the first cry pierced the room. "A boy." Dante stepped forward, his breath catching. But the labor didn't stop. A second cry followed, a girl. And then a third, another boy. The room fell silent. Even the cold doctor looked stunned. "Triplets." "3." Dante whispered, his voice cracking for the first time. He looked at the 3 tiny, red-faced infants. For a moment, the ice in his chest seemed to hairline fracture. He looked at Aria, who lay gray and lifeless on the blood-stained sheets. "She's hemorrhaging," the nurse muttered, finally showing a spark of humanity. "Let her rest," Gia snapped, stepping between Dante and the bed. "She's exhausted. Dante, look at them. These are your heirs. But look at how pale they are. Aria must have been neglecting her health during the pregnancy just to spite you." Gia leaned in close to Dante, her voice a poisonous honey. "The doctor says the eldest, the first boy, is the strongest. The other 2, they might not survive the night. It's Aria's fault. She didn't want this life, remember? She probably tried to hurt them." Dante's face hardened again. The brief moment of empathy was smothered by the years of bitterness and the lies Gia had fed him. He reached out and picked up the firstborn boy, Luca. "Take the other 2 to the nursery," Dante ordered, his voice returning to its iron state. "And get a vet to stitch her up. I'm going to the study." "But Mr. Moretti, she needs a surgeon," the nurse started. "I said a vet," Dante roared, his rage exploding. "She treated my life like a game, so she will be treated like the animal she is." He walked out, clutching Luca to his chest. Gia lingered for a moment, looking down at the semi-conscious Aria. She leaned down, her breath cold against Aria's ear. You should have died in the mountains, Rose, Gia hissed. I'm the only Rose now. And don't worry about the other two brats. I'll make sure they don't trouble Dante for long. Aria's eyes fluttered open, catching a glimpse of Gia's murderous expression before darkness finally claimed her. Will Dante realize his Rose was right in front of him all along? Watch the reveal now. The guest room was silent, save for the rhythmic drip of a leaky faucet and the ragged, shallow breathing of a woman left for dead. Aria lay on the mattress, her body a map of agony. The vet Dante had ordered had been as rough as promised, leaving her with jagged stitches and a fever that burned like a wildfire in her veins. Every time she tried to close her eyes, the image of Dante walking away with her firstborn scorched her mind. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Aria froze, her instincts screaming. It wasn't the heavy, authoritative thud of Dante's boots, nor the light, airy step of a maid. It was the predatory, silent slide of Gia Rossi. Aria squeezed her eyes shut, feigning unconsciousness. Through her lashes, she saw Gia slip into the room. The woman wasn't wearing her usual silk. She was draped in a dark trench coat, her eyes darting around with a frantic, manic energy. Gia walked to the two small bassinets where the younger triplets, the weak ones, lay. Such a shame, Gia whispered, her voice a poisonous caress. Dante only wants the strong heir. He doesn't even know you two exist in his records yet. If you simply stop breathing, he'll think it was just the mother's weak blood. And once you're gone, I'll find a way to make sure the first one follows, so I can give Dante a pure child of my own. Aria's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she feared it would shatter. She watched in horror as Gia reached into her pocket and pulled out a small glass vial and a syringe. The woman's intent was clear, a lethal injection that would be written off as sudden infant death. With a surge of maternal adrenaline that defied the laws of biology, Aria threw herself off the bed. She didn't have the strength to stand, so she lunged, her weight colliding with Gia's knees. Both women crashed to the stone floor. The syringe skittered across the room, shattering against the wall. "You monster!" Aria hissed, her voice a guttural growl. She clawed at Gia's face, her broken nails drawing blood. Gia shrieked, kicking Aria in her fresh stitches. Aria gasped, the world spinning into white-hot pain, but she didn't let go. She grabbed a heavy brass candle holder from the bedside table and swung it with the last of her strength. It caught Gia on the temple, sending the woman slumped and unconscious to the floor. Aria knew she had minutes, perhaps seconds. She crawled to the bassinets. Her daughter and her youngest son, Nico, were awake, their wide eyes staring up at her. They didn't cry. It was as if they understood the life-or-death silence required of them. "I have to leave him," Aria sobbed, looking toward the door, knowing Luca was floors above in the master nursery, guarded by Dante's men. "If I go for Luca, we all die. If I stay, you two die." It was a choice that tore her soul in half. She wrapped the two infants in thick wool blankets and tucked them into a laundry basket, covering them with soiled linens. Dragging her body through the servants' tunnel, a passage she had scrubbed only weeks prior, she bled onto the cold stones she had once cleaned. She reached the back gate, where the cliffside path led down to the black surf of the ocean. A small delivery van was idling, the driver a young man Aria had once shown kindness to by sharing her meager rations. "Get us out of here," Aria pleaded, collapsing into the back of the van. "Please. I'll give you anything." "I don't want your money, Mrs. Moretti," the boy whispered, looking at her blood-stained clothes in horror. "I just want to be able to sleep at night." As the van sped away from the Moretti manor, Aria looked back at the fortress on the cliff. She saw the light in the master nursery go on. Dante was there. He had her son, but he had lost his heart. "I'll come back for you, Luca," she promised the distant light. "I'll become someone they can't break." I'll become the storm that levels this house. 5 years passed in a blur of survival and transformation. In the bustling streets of a foreign city, Aria Thorne died, and Alara Vance was born. She worked 3 jobs, her nights spent studying early childhood development and her days spent raising Nico and her daughter Maya. She moved with the grace of a woman who had survived the end of the world, her innocence replaced by a razor-sharp intelligence. But her heart remained in that gray stone manor. Reports reached her through back channels. Luca Moretti was a problem child. He was 5 years old and had never spoken a word. Dante had searched for Aria for months after her disappearance, not out of love, she assumed, but out of a desire to punish her for stealing his property. Gia was still there, playing the role of the devoted stepmother, while Luca withered under her care. Aria looked at her reflection in the mirror. Her hair was different, her gaze was hardened, and her resolve was absolute. She had perfected the persona of a world-class educational therapist, a shadow nanny capable of reaching the most traumatized children. It was time. She packed a single suitcase. In the hidden compartment lay the dried mountain flower and a burner phone with one contact, the Moretti Household Staffing Agency. The gates of the Moretti Manor groaned open, a sound that felt like the jaw of a great beast widening to swallow Aria whole. 5 years had passed, but the air here still held that same suffocating chill. She sat in the back of a black car, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was no longer the broken girl in a stained gray uniform. She was Dr. Alara Vance, an internationally renowned child behavioral specialist with a portfolio that commanded respect and a gaze that gave nothing away. She had altered her appearance with subtle precision. Her dark hair was now a sleek, honey-toned bob, and her amber eyes were framed by sophisticated glasses. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that projected cold, professional competence. But beneath the silk lining of her jacket, pressed against her skin, was the mountain flower locket, a jagged reminder of why she was stepping back into this graveyard of memories. Dante Moretti awaited her in the grand study. The room was exactly as she remembered. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany, the scent of expensive bourbon, and an overwhelming atmosphere of power. Dante sat behind his desk, more imposing than ever. The years had added silver to his temples and deepened the lines of cynicism around his mouth. He looked like a man who had conquered the world but found it tasted like ash. "Dr. Vance," he said, his voice a low vibration that made Aria's skin crawl with recognition. He didn't stand. "You come highly recommended. They say you can make the stones speak." "I specialize in trauma-induced mutism, Mr. Moretti," Aria replied, her voice steady and clinical. "I don't make children speak. I provide them with a world where they feel safe enough to find their own voice." Dante leaned forward, his dark eyes searching her face with a sudden, sharp intensity. For a heartbeat, Aria feared the mask had slipped, but he simply gestured toward a tablet on his desk showing CCTV footage of a small boy sitting in the center of a perfectly white room, staring at a blank wall. "My son, Luca, has not uttered a syllable in 5 years," Dante said, and for the first time, Aria heard a crack in the granite. "He is the heir to the Moretti legacy, yet he is a ghost in his own home. Every therapist I've hired has ended up in tears or dismissed. What makes you different?" "I don't care about your legacy, Mr. Moretti," Aria said, stepping closer. "I care about the boy. If I take this case, I require total autonomy. That means no interference from your staff, and certainly no interference from your fiancé." At the mention of Gia, the air in the room turned arctic. Before Dante could respond, the study door swung open. Gia Rossi swept in, looking as radiant and lethal as a poisonous flower. She was draped in diamonds, her smile not reaching her calculating eyes. "Dante, darling, are we still entertaining these experts?" Gia asked, her voice the same honeyed venom Aria remembered from the guest room floor. She turned her gaze to Aria, squinting slightly. "You look familiar, Doctor. Have we met?" Aria met her gaze with a cool, professional blankness. "I doubt it, Miss Rossi. I spend most of my time in clinics abroad. Familiarity is often a trick of the light." "Gia, Dr. Vance is here to see Luca," Dante interrupted, his tone dismissive. He turned back to Aria. "You have 1 month. If there is no progress, you leave. If you succeed, name your price." "I've already named it," Aria said, picking up her leather briefcase. "I want the West Wing cleared. I start tonight." As she walked toward the nursery, her heart felt like it was going to burst through her ribs. She navigated the hallways by memory, avoiding the service stairs where she had once bled. When she reached the nursery door, she took a deep breath and pushed it open. The room was filled with the most expensive toys money could buy, yet it felt like a prison. In the corner, a small boy sat with his back to her. He was small for his age, his dark hair messy, his shoulders hunched. Aria's vision blurred with tears she couldn't afford to shed. Luca. She didn't approach him. She sat on the floor near the door and opened her bag, pulling out a set of simple wooden carving tools and a piece of soft pine. She began to work in silence, the rhythmic shave of the wood filling the room. For nearly an hour, the boy didn't move. Then, slowly, he turned his head. His eyes were Dante's eyes, deep, dark, and filled with an ancient sorrow, but his mouth was hers. He looked at her with a profound, soul-deep suspicion. Aria didn't look up, but she began to hum a low, haunting melody. It was the song she had hummed to the triplets in the womb, a song of mountain mist and hidden flowers. Luca froze. His small fingers, which had been picking at the carpet, stilled. He crawled a few inches closer, his head tilted like a wounded animal hearing a familiar call from a past life. Suddenly, the door was flung open. "Time for his medication," Gia announced, trailing a nurse. She marched toward Luca with a predatory stride. "Come here, you little brat. Stop staring at the stranger." Luca immediately recoiled, his face contorting in terror. He scrambled into the furthest corner, letting out a silent, heartbreaking scream of agony. "Get out," Aria said, standing up. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a death warrant. "Excuse me," Gia gasped, her face flushing with rage. "I am the mistress of this house, and I am the doctor in charge of this patient," Aria replied, stepping between Gia and the trembling boy. She saw the way Luca looked at Gia, not with love, but with the raw, paralyzed fear of a victim. "Your presence is causing a massive sympathetic nervous system spike. If you want him to speak, you will leave. Now." Gia opened her mouth to shriek, but Dante was suddenly there, standing in the doorway. He looked from the terrified boy to the defiant doctor. "Gia, out," Dante commanded. "But Dante." "Now," he growled. Gia stormed out, but as she passed Aria, she leaned in, her voice a serrated whisper. "I don't know who you are, doctor, but I destroyed the last woman who tried to play hero in this house. I'll enjoy breaking you even more." When the door finally closed, the room fell into a heavy silence. Dante remained by the door, watching Aria. She ignored him and knelt back down on the floor, extending the small wooden bird she had been carving toward Luca. The boy hesitated, then reached out a trembling hand. As his small fingers brushed hers, a spark of recognition seemed to flash in his eyes. He didn't speak, but he leaned his forehead against Aria's hand, a silent plea for protection. Dante watched the scene, his jaw tightening. He felt a strange, painful tug in his chest, a feeling he hadn't felt since a girl in the mountains had shared her bread with him. He looked at the shadow nanny and felt a dangerous, magnetic pull. "Who are you really, Dr. Vance?" he murmured to the empty air. Aria didn't answer. She held her son, her heart screaming the truth that her lips had to hide. The grand ballroom of the Moretti estate was a sea of shimmering silk, expensive champagne, and lethal secrets. The occasion was the Moretti Group's 50th anniversary, a night designed to project power and stability. For Dante, it was a performance. For Gia, it was a coronation. But for Aria, standing in the shadows of the balcony, it was a battlefield. Against her professional advice, Gia had insisted that Luca be presented to the elite. He is the heir, she had argued to Dante, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. If the world sees him locked away, they will think he is weak. Let me handle him. Aria watched from the periphery, dressed in a discreet black cocktail dress that allowed her to blend into the staff. Her heart ached as she saw Luca. The boy was dressed in a miniature tuxedo, his face deathly pale, his small hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He was being paraded like a trophy by Gia, who held his hand with a grip so tight his knuckles were white. The noise of the gala was a physical assault. The clinking of crystal, the roar of 100 voices, and the aggressive brass of the live orchestra created a sensory nightmare for a child with Luca's history. "Smile, you little freak," Gia hissed under her breath, her face fixed in a glamorous mask for the photographers. "If you embarrass me tonight, I'll make sure your shadow nanny is fired by morning." The trigger was a tray of champagne flutes shattering on the marble floor near the stage. The sound was like a gunshot. Luca's nervous system, already pushed to the brink, finally snapped. He let out a silent, ragged gasp and began to claw at his own ears, his eyes rolling back. He collapsed to his knees, his body shaking in a full-blown sensory meltdown. The ballroom fell silent. The elite whispered behind their fans. Dante took a step forward, his face a mixture of alarm and suppressed shame. Gia, terrified of the social embarrassment, grabbed Luca by the shoulders and began to shake him. "Stand up. Luca, stop this at once," she snarled, her mask slipping. "You're making a scene." Dante's voice boomed over the crowd. "Gia, leave him." But he didn't know how to approach the boy. Every time he moved closer, Luca's tremors worsened. Dante was a man who could command armies, but he was powerless against his son's invisible pain. Aria didn't wait for permission. She moved through the crowd like a dark streak of lightning. She shoved past a startled countess and knelt on the floor, ignoring the gasps of the onlookers. "Out of the way," she commanded Gia, her voice vibrating with maternal authority. "You. This is your fault." Gia shrieked, but Aria ignored her. Aria didn't grab Luca. Instead, she sat on the floor behind him, creating a human barrier between him and the crowd. She pulled a heavy weighted velvet cloak from a nearby display and draped it firmly over his shoulders, the deep pressure helping to ground his frazzled nerves. Then she began to hum. It wasn't a song for a gala. It was the low, rhythmic lullaby of the mountains. "Where the roses grow in the snow, wait for me and I will know." Slowly, the violent shaking began to subside. Luca's hands moved from his ears to grasp Aria's forearms. He buried his face in her neck, his breath coming in jagged hitches. To the shock of everyone in the room, the difficult air began to calm down in the arms of the nanny. Dante stood over them, his shadow long and imposing. He looked down at the woman holding his son. The way she hummed, the specific tilt of her head, it was a ghost of a memory that had haunted him for 20 years. His chest tightened with a physical ache so sharp he almost gasped. "Take him upstairs," Dante ordered, his voice unusually thick. He looked at the crowd, his eyes cold enough to freeze the champagne in their glasses. "The gala is over. My son is unwell." "Dante, you can't be serious." Gia cried, her face contorted in rage. "We have investors here. This woman is overstepping." "I said it is over," Dante roared. Aria lifted Luca into her arms. He was 5 years old, but he felt as light as a feather, a testament to how little he had thrived. As she carried him toward the stairs, she felt Dante's gaze burning into her back. Back in the safety of the nursery, the silence was a relief. Aria laid Luca on his bed and stayed with him until his breathing became deep and even. She was about to leave when she felt a presence in the doorway. Dante was leaning against the frame, his tie loosened, looking more human and more dangerous than she had ever seen him. "That song," Dante said, his voice a low rumble in the dimly lit room. "Where did you learn it?" Aria stiffened, her back to him. "It's an old folk melody, Mr. Moretti. Useful for calming overstimulated children. I've only ever heard one person sing it." Dante stepped into the room, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet. He stopped inches behind her. The heat radiating from his body was a memory she had tried to burn out of her soul. A girl in the mountains. A girl I've spent my life trying to find. Aria turned slowly, her professional mask firmly in place. "Then I suggest you keep looking for her, Mr. Moretti, instead of projecting her onto the staff. Your son needs stability, not a father who is chasing ghosts." Dante reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from her cheek. "There is a fire in your eyes that shouldn't belong to a stranger. And Luca, he doesn't trust anyone. Yet he clings to you as if you are his very life." "Children have good instincts," Aria replied, her heart hammering against her ribs. "They know who truly wants to protect them and who wants to use them as a prop." Dante's eyes darkened, a flash of suspicion crossing his face. "Are you accusing Gia?" "I'm telling you to open your eyes, Dante," she said, using his name for the first time. The slip made his breath hitch. "Look at your son. Really look at him. He isn't mute because he can't speak. He's mute because he's terrified of what will happen if he does." Before Dante could respond, a cold voice interrupted from the hallway. "How touching." Gia stood there, her eyes narrowed to slits. She had seen the intimacy in the room, the way Dante looked at the nanny. Her hands were clenched so tight her manicured nails were drawing blood from her palms. "Dante, your sister is on the phone." "It's urgent," Gia lied, her voice trembling with suppressed fury. Dante took one last look at Aria, a look filled with a confusing blend of longing and obsession, before turning to leave. As Gia followed him, she paused in the doorway, her face twisting into a mask of pure malice. "You think you've won because you calmed a brat?" Gia whispered to Aria. "I've spent 5 years building my kingdom. I won't let a servant in a cheap suit take it from me. Enjoy your time with Luca. Doctor. It's going to be shorter than you think." Aria looked at the sleeping boy, her resolve hardening. The game had changed. Dante was starting to remember, and Gia was starting to panic. The innocence that Dante thought he hated was the only thing that could save them all. But first, she had to survive the trap Gia was undoubtedly setting. Will Dante realize his Rose was right in front of him all along? Watch the reveal now. The air in the Moretti manor had grown thick with a different kind of tension. No longer was it just the coldness of Dante's disdain. It was the frantic, jagged energy of a predator cornered. Gia Rossi knew the walls were closing in. Every time she saw Dante looking at the shadow nanny with that haunted, hungry expression, she felt the foundation of her 5-year lie crumbling. Aria was in the nursery, packing a small bag for Luca's afternoon therapy session in the garden, when she noticed her jewelry box had been moved. It was a simple, locked wooden case she kept hidden in the back of her wardrobe. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She didn't care about the few pieces of gold she owned, but inside that box, tucked into a velvet lining, was the mountain flower locket, the only evidence of her life as Rose. She opened the box. It was empty. Looking for this? Gia's voice sliced through the silence of the room. Aria turned to see Gia standing in the doorway, dangling the silver locket by its delicate chain. The woman's face was twisted into a triumphant sneer. Beside her stood two of Dante's most formidable security guards, their faces impassive. "I found this in your room during a routine security sweep for the master," Gia lied, her eyes gleaming with malice. "It's funny, isn't it? This locket is a replica of the one Dante gave to his Rose 20 years ago. The one I supposedly lost during the chaos of the Mafia Wars." "Give it back," Aria said, her voice low and dangerous. "Oh, I'll give it back," Gia laughed, "to Dante. Along with the report that you broke into the master's private vault and stole it. Stealing a family heirloom is a high offense in this house, Dr. Vance. But stealing the only memory he has of the woman he loves? That's a death sentence." Before Aria could move, the guard stepped forward, pinning her arms behind her back. Gia leaned in close, the scent of her expensive, cloying perfume making Aria's stomach churn. "I don't know how you got your hands on a copy of this, but it's the perfect weapon to get rid of you. Dante is already in the study, and he is, let's just say, less than pleased." Aria was marched through the manor like a common criminal. The servants whispered as she passed, the same way they had whispered 5 years ago. When the study doors opened, the atmosphere was suffocating. Dante stood by the window, his back to the room, his silhouette framed by the gathering storm clouds outside. "Dante, look what I found," Gia cried, her voice shifting instantly into a tone of wounded betrayal. "She stole it. She went into your private sanctuary and took the locket. She's been trying to study me, Dante. She's trying to mimic Rose, so she can seduce you and take over this family." Dante turned slowly. His eyes were bloodshot, fixed on the silver pendant in Gia's hand. He took it from her, his fingers trembling slightly as he brushed the engraved petals of the mountain flower. This was the piece of jewelry he had searched for every day for 5 years, the one Gia claimed she had lost when he rescued her from the mountain clinic. He walked toward Aria, his presence an overwhelming wave of dark fury. He stopped inches from her face, the locket held between them like a shard of broken glass. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice a jagged whisper. "It belongs to me, Dante," Aria said, refusing to flinch. "It has always belonged to me." "Liar!" Gia shrieked. "She's a fraud, Dante. She probably found an old photo of it and had it forged." Dante's hand shot out, grabbing Aria's chin, forcing her to look at him. "This locket has a secret. Only 2 people in the world know how to open it. If you are the thief Gia says you are, you won't know the trick." He held it out to her. Aria's hands were released by the guards. She took the cold metal, her thumb finding the tiny, almost invisible notch near the stem of the flower, a detail she had carved herself with a needle when she was a child. With a soft click, the locket sprang open. Inside was not a photo but a tiny, pressed sprig of the actual mountain flower from 20 years ago, preserved in resin. On the inner lid, a single word was engraved in a messy, childish hand. "Liam." Dante froze. The world seemed to stop spinning. He hadn't told anyone about the name Liam. It was the name his mother had called him before the family changed their identity to Lee and then Moretti to escape the purge. Not even Gia knew that name. "How?" Dante breathed, his voice breaking. "I didn't steal it, Dante," Aria said, her eyes shimmering with tears. "I've carried it for 20 years. Through the mountains, through the wedding that turned into a funeral, and through the night, you let a vet stitch me up while you took my son." Gia's face went from pale to a ghostly translucent white. "Dante, she's lying. She's playing with your mind. She's a professional, remember? She's a behavioral expert." Dante didn't look at Gia. He was staring at Aria, his brain struggling to reconcile the shadow nanny with the innocent girl he had tormented. The realization was a physical blow, a tidal wave of regret that threatened to drown him. "Aria," he whispered, the name tasting like a prayer on his tongue. But before the moment could break, a frantic voice came over the security intercom. "Master. It's Master Luca. He's collapsed in the garden. He's not breathing." The locket fell to the floor, forgotten. The trauma of the present eclipsed the ghosts of the past. Aria was the first one out the door, her medical instincts overriding her own pain. Dante followed, his heart hammering with a new, terrifying fear. Gia stood alone in the study, looking down at the open locket. Her eyes darted around like a trapped animal. The trap she had set for Aria had backfired, but as she watched them run toward the garden, a dark, murderous thought took hold. If she couldn't be the mistress of the Moretti house, she would make sure there was no family left to rule it. "You want to be the mother so badly, Aria?" Gia hissed to the empty room. "Then let's see if your golden blood can save him when I'm done." The garden, once a place of meticulously manicured peace, had transformed into a scene of chaotic desperation. Luca lay on the grass, his small face a terrifying shade of blue. His lungs, constricted by a severe allergic reaction to a substance hidden in his afternoon tea, were failing. Aria reached him first. She fell to her knees, her medical training taking over even as her heart screamed in agony. She checked his pulse. It was thready and weak. Dante arrived seconds later, his face ashen, his hands hovering over his son with a helplessness that was visceral. "He's not breathing, Aria. Do something." Dante roared, the command breaking into a sob. "He's in anaphylactic shock," Aria said, her fingers flying as she tore open her medical bag. She administered an emergency shot, but Luca's body didn't respond. "He's lost too much blood volume from internal hemorrhaging. He's had a reaction that triggered a secondary hematological crisis. He needs a transfusion. Now." The manor's private medical wing was prepped in minutes, but the news was grim. Luca possessed the golden blood, the extremely rare Rh null phenotype. The hospital's reserves were empty, and the nearest donor was hours away. "I'll do it," Gia announced, rushing into the room. She looked at Dante, her eyes wide with fake desperation. "I'm his mother in spirit, Dante. My blood is a match. I know it is." The doctors tested her quickly. The results came back negative. Gia wasn't even the right blood group, let alone the rare phenotype. She stood back, her face twisting as the doctors ignored her. "Test me," Aria said, stepping toward the bed. "Doctor, the chances of you having Rh null are 1 in 6 million, the lead surgeon said. "Test me," Aria repeated, her voice like iron. Minutes later, the lab technician ran back into the room, his eyes wide with disbelief. "It's a perfect match. Not just a match, it's an identical biological signature." Dante froze. He looked from the lab report to Aria. The weight of the truth was finally crushing him. Only a biological mother or a sibling could have such a perfect signature for a child with Rh null blood. Aria didn't wait for his epiphany. She lay on the bed next to Luca, her arm outstretched. As the needle entered her vein, she looked at her son. "I'm here, Luca. Mommy's here." The blood began to flow from her body into his. Because Luca's crisis was so severe, the doctors had to take more than the standard amount. Aria's face grew paler with every passing minute. Her vision began to swim, the edges of the room blurring into a gray haze. "That's enough," Dante whispered, stepping to the side of her bed. He reached out, his hand shaking as he stroked her hair. "Aria, stop. You're going to die." He needs it," Aria gasped, her voice barely audible. She felt the life draining out of her, but she watched as the color began to return to Luca's cheeks. Gia, realizing she was seconds away from total exposure, stepped forward. Dante, the doctor is clearly confused. She probably had a secret transfusion herself to fake the results. She's trying to steal the credit for saving him. Dante didn't even look at her. He leaned over Aria, his tears falling onto her hand. "I know," he whispered. "I know everything now. You're Rose. You're the girl from the wedding. You're the mother of my son." Aria smiled, a weak, beautiful thing. "And the others," she whispered. "Nico and Maya." Her eyes closed. The heart monitor connected to Aria let out a long, terrifying drone. "Aria!" Dante screamed. At that moment, the door to the medical wing burst open. A small boy, a carbon copy of Luca but with a fierce protective spark in his eyes, stood there holding the hand of a little girl who looked exactly like a young Aria. "Let go of our mommy!" Nico shouted, charging toward the bed. Dante looked at the two children, then back at the woman, dying to save his heir. The everyone in regret moment had arrived. Dante Moretti, the brutal boss, fell to his knees between the beds of his wife and his son, a broken man in a kingdom of his own making. The medical wing of the Moretti manor was gripped by a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the synchronized beeping of two heart monitors. Dante remained on his knees, his forehead resting against the edge of Aria's bed. His hand, once used to sign death warrants and cold contracts, trembled as it gripped her limp fingers. "Let go of her!" The high-pitched, defiant voice made Dante lift his head. Standing just feet away was a boy who felt like a ghost from a past life. Nico was the image of Dante at 5 years old. The same defiant brow, the same stubborn chin, and the same aura of unyielding strength. Beside him, Maya clutched his hand, her wide amber eyes filled with a mixture of terror and ancient wisdom. Dante's breath hitched. He looked from Nico to the sleeping Luca, then back to Aria. The biological impossibility was staring him in the face. Triplets. She hadn't just fled 5 years ago. She had carried 2/3 of his heart across an ocean to protect them from his own cruelty. "Who are you?" Dante whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm Nico and she's Maya," the boy said, stepping in front of his sister to shield her. "And that's our mommy. We saw what you did on the cameras. You took her blood. You're the bad man she told us about." The words were a physical blow to Dante's chest. The bad man. He had spent years imagining he was the hero of his own tragic love story, waiting for a Rose who turned out to be a viper in silk, while he became the villain in the lives of his own children. Dante started, but the words, "I'm your father," died in his throat. He hadn't earned that title. He had bought their mother for $80 million and treated her like a servant. Gia, realizing her empire was turning to ash, let out a shrill, hysterical laugh from the corner of the room. "Dante, don't listen to them. Look at them, they're street urchins. She probably adopted them to use as leverage for when she returned. It's a scam, Dante. A long con." Dante stood up slowly. The grief in his eyes didn't vanish, but it was joined by a cold, murderous clarity. He turned toward Gia, his shadow stretching across the floor like a shroud. "The blood test didn't lie, Gia," Dante said, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "The locket didn't lie. And these children, they carry a face that has haunted my family for generations. But you lied about the mountains. You lied about the birth. You lied about the blood. Dante, I did it for us." Gia screamed, backing away as he approached. "Aria was a nobody. I was the one who stayed. I was the one who played the mother to that silent freak." The moment the words "silent freak" left her mouth, a heavy glass carafe from the bedside table shattered against the wall inches from her head. Dante hadn't thrown it. He looked over to see Luca, his eldest son, sitting up in bed. Luca's face was still pale, but his eyes were burning with a terrifying intensity. He looked at Gia, then at the two children standing by the door. His lips trembled, his throat working as he tried to force air through vocal cords that had been frozen by fear for 5 years. Mommy," Luca rasped. The sound was small, like the cracking of thin ice, but it echoed through the room like a thunderclap. "Luca," Dante whispered, turning to his son. "She hit me," Luca said, his voice growing stronger, fueled by a half-decade of suppressed trauma. He pointed a shaking finger at Gia. "When you weren't looking," she said. "If I talked, she'd kill the girl in the picture. The girl with the flower." The room went cold. Dante felt his soul fracture. He had left his son in the hands of a monster because he was too blinded by a fake past to see the real present. He turned back to Gia, his hand reaching for the silenced pistol in his waistband. "Dante, no." Aria's voice was weak, but it stopped him instantly. She had regained consciousness, her face still ghostly from the blood loss, but her eyes were clear. She reached out, her hand finding Nico and Maya, pulling them toward the bed. "Don't do it in front of them," Aria whispered, her gaze moving from Dante to her 3 children. "They've seen enough blood today." Dante looked at his 3 children, Nico, Maya, and Luca, finally reunited. He looked at the woman he had humiliated, the woman who had just died and come back to life to save the heir he didn't deserve. The everyone in regret phase had reached its peak. The Thorne family, who had arrived at the manor house an hour earlier to demand more money, stood in the doorway, frozen in horror as they realized the transaction they had sold was now the queen of the Moretti Empire. "Guards," Dante commanded, not taking his eyes off Aria. "Take Gia Rossi to the basement. Do not let her die. I want her to live long enough to feel every ounce of the cold she gave my wife." As Gia was dragged out screaming, Dante turned back to the bed. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He knew he didn't deserve it yet. Instead, he knelt before Aria and the 3 children, bowing his head in total submission. "I was the big idiot," Dante whispered, repeating the words he had overheard Nico whisper earlier. "I am the man who had the sun in his house and complained it was too bright. Aria, Rose, I will spend the rest of my life in the shadows if it means you and the children can live in the light." Nico looked at the man kneeling before them, then at his mother. "Is he still the bad man, Mommy?" Aria looked at Dante, the boy Liam who had saved her, the man Dante who had broken her, and the father who was finally, painfully, waking up. "He's a man who has a lot of making up to do," Aria said, her hand resting on Luca's head while her other arm held the twins. "Don't miss the moment the triplets finally reunite. Subscribe for more." The grand studio of the Moretti Manor, a room once strictly off-limits to Aria, was now bathed in the soft apologetic light of a setting sun. Dante stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the ghosts of his own making. On the walls hung a single painting, a crude but vibrant depiction of a mountain sunrise, signed with a small, messy W in the corner. Aria walked into the room, her steps slow but steady. Behind her, the triplets were being watched by the few loyal staff members who remained. The Thorne family had been banished. Their greed finally met with a legal firewall that stripped them of every cent of the $80 million they had squandered. "You called it your sanctuary," Aria said, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "But it was a mausoleum for a woman who was standing right in front of you." Dante turned. He looked aged. His eyes carried the weight of 1,000 regrets. He pointed to the painting. "I changed my name to Dante Moretti to hide from the men who killed my father, Fu. But before that I was Fu Bachin. And you were Wan Wan, the girl who shared her bread and her dreams with a boy who had nothing." Aria walked to the painting, her fingers tracing the W. I looked for Bachin for years. When I was forced to marry the brutal boss, Dante, I thought the world was playing a cruel joke on me. I hated you because you weren't him. I didn't realize the man I loved had simply let his heart freeze into a block of ice. I married Gia because she had the other half of that painting, Dante whispered, his voice trembling with shame. She stole it from your father's study years ago. She used your past to steal my future. And now? Aria asked, turning to face him. The truth is out. The villains are in the shadows. But 5 years of blood and silence don't vanish because of a name change, Dante. I know, Dante said. He stepped toward her but stopped, giving her the space he had once denied her. I have ordered the dismantling of the Thorne Empire. Every person who touched you or the children with malice will face the full weight of the Moretti name. But that isn't enough. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a new contract. It wasn't the servant's contract from their wedding day. It was a deed of total transfer. Everything, Dante said. The manor, the business, the legacy. It's all in your name. I am no longer the master of this house. I am merely a man hoping for a chance to be a father. The doors to the studio creaked open. Luca, Nico, and Maya peered inside. Luca, no longer mute, looked at the painting and then at his father. Is the bad man gone now? Luca asked. Dante knelt on the floor, his head bowed. The bad man is trying to be better, Luca. But only if your mommy lets him stay. The triplets looked at Aria. She looked at the man who had been her childhood savior, her greatest tormentor, and now her most devoted subject. The innocence he thought he had melted had actually been the fire that forged her into a queen. She looked at her 3 children, the living proof of her resilience. We aren't going abroad, Aria said softly, the decision final. This house has been cold for too long. It's time we brought the mountain sun back into these walls. Dante looked up, hope finally flickering in his dark eyes. He reached out, and this time when Aria took his hand, it wasn't a transaction. It was a beginning. The Moretti manor was no longer a fortress of fear. As the children ran toward the painting, their laughter filling the once silent halls, the everyone in regret arc concluded with the only thing that could truly heal a mafia boss's heart, the unconditional love of the woman he had tried to break but who had ultimately saved him.